I could diagnose diseases with precision. I knew the name of every bone, every artery, every symptom. In the operating room, I was the respected doctor. In the temple, the priest who chanted mantras in Sanskrit with devotion. Eyes closed, voice firm, I conducted rituals according to tradition. To everyone around me, I was the balance between science and spirituality. But the white coat I wore during the day could no longer hide the questions that accompanied me when I lay down at night. I was admired by many, but not by myself. No matter how much I healed others, I felt that something in me was sick. And then, one ordinary day, leafing through a book, I read a verse in Arabic. I expected nothing, but that passage, simple and direct, pierced through me. It was as if a door, which I didn't even know existed, had been unlocked from within, and it never closed again. My name is Anirudh Vyas. I am 58 years old and was born in India, between two worlds that have walked with me since forever, medicine and Hinduism. To my patients, I am Dr. Vyas, firm, reliable, calm. To my community, I was Pandit Anirudh, the man of ancient chants, rituals, Sanskrit. But between these two roles there was a silent space. I healed bodies. I conducted ceremonies. But inside me, something remained restless. I was never a man of confrontations. I never sought religious debates or easy answers. I always believed that faith should be reasoned, felt with the heart, and evaluated with honesty. But over time I began to notice. The more I studied, the more questions arose. And when I looked at my daughter, now Muslim, and saw the serenity with which she raised her children, I understood that there was something there that I still didn't possess. That wasn't doubt. It was thirst. Before continuing this testimony, write here in the comments from which country you are watching this video. I really want to know how far this message is reaching, because if it reached you, perhaps it's because you too are looking for answers, just as I searched. For many years, I felt safe within the religious routine. I would wake up before sunrise, perform my ablutions, prepare the altar with fresh flowers, light the lamps, and begin the chants. Each mantra had a specific melody. Each gesture had its time. Everything was in place except me. I realized gradually that my faith had transformed into an automatic ritual. People came to the temple, offered fruits, repeated words they didn't understand, and left with the same anguish in their eyes. It was as if we were all in a theater play, and I, ironically, in the role of guide. But how could I guide someone to a place I couldn't find myself? I remember one ceremony in particular. A young man had died in an accident. The mother, desperate, held my hands and asked, "Where is he now? Can you guarantee that he is at peace?" In that instant I was speechless. I repeated the verses I always repeated. I performed the prescribed prayers, but inside, I just wanted to embrace her and say, "I don't know either." It was during this time that I began to question myself more deeply. Why do we repeat so many mantras without understanding what they mean? Why do we invoke so many different deities, but remain confused about who is really the creator? Why, after so much study, did I still feel so distant from God? I looked at the shelf in my office, filled with Vedic texts, translations of the Ramayana, commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, and I realized that the more I read, the more alone I felt. Spirituality had become erudition, and worship an aesthetic exercise. It was there, in that uncomfortable silence, that I decided to stop repeating and start searching, not for a new religion, but for an answer, a truth that didn't need to be embellished, recited, or disguised, a faith that spoke directly to my heart and not just to my memory. And it was in that dry soil of the soul that something new began to sprout. It was an evening like any other. The temple was full. There were fresh flowers on the altar, incense burning, and children running through the corridors before the ceremony began. I put on my white robe, tied the sash around my waist, took a deep breath, and began the recitation of mantras I had repeated hundreds of times throughout my life. My movements were firm, my voice was at the right tone, but inside me there was a screaming silence. On that occasion, I was called to conduct a funeral ritual. A young man of only 22 years had died after a cardiac complication. The family was devastated, especially the mother, a simple woman with sunken eyes and trembling hands. While I chanted the verses of passage, she approached, grabbed my arm and whispered, "Pandit, is my son at peace? Is he with God now?" I can't explain what happened inside me at that moment. Perhaps it was the tone of her voice, Perhaps the desperation in her eyes. Perhaps the fact that there she didn't want a priest. She wanted certainty, but I couldn't answer. I just lowered my eyes. The song came out of my mouth, but my heart was mute. I continued the ritual, but for the first time in my life, I felt tears falling in the middle of the ceremony. I, who had always maintained a firm and serene posture, couldn't contain what was happening inside me. It was as if all the weight of doubts I had carried for years was overflowing there, on that stone floor between petals and ashes. That day marked me deeply, not because of the family's pain, although it was real, but because for the first time I realized I was lying, not purposely, but yes, representing something I no longer truly believed. I didn't know where that young man had gone. I couldn't guarantee that the chanted verses had conducted his soul somewhere. And worse, I couldn't guarantee that even to myself. It was on that day that something inside me died, and paradoxically, it was the beginning of something new. I finished the ritual, went to my room, removed the robe, and looked in the mirror. "Who are you now, Anirudh?" I thought. The answer didn't have a name yet, but the search for it had already begun, and I knew there would be no turning back. It was by chance, or at least, that's what I thought. I was in an old bookstore in downtown Jaipur, looking for a new translation of the Rig Veda, a specific edition, commented by a contemporary author who had studied in Europe. As always, I entered, went straight to the religion section, and began searching through the shelves. That's when I saw a book with a dark cover and golden letters, the Quran, translation and commentary. It was an old edition, carefully bound. I hesitated. I had never read the Quran. I knew some passages from what others had said, but I had never allowed myself to read it with my own eyes. The cover attracted me. Perhaps it was the simplicity, perhaps it was the silence around. I took the book and opened it to a random page. The first sentence I read said, "This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guide for the God-fearing." Surprisingly, I didn't feel invaded, nor confused. I felt peace. A peace different from that promised in mantras. It was a sober peace that seemed to tell me, "You have searched enough. Now, read." I returned home with that book hidden among others. I spent weeks opening it little by little. Each time I read, a part of me trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. The clarity of language, the absence of artifice, the way the text spoke directly to the soul, without needing intermediaries, bells or smoke. I felt before something raw, real, and infinitely greater than me. The most disconcerting thing, however, was realizing that many principles I had studied in the Vedas were there, but in a purer, more objective, closer form. The oneness of God, detachment from the world, personal responsibility before good and evil. They weren't foreign ideas. They were truths I already sensed, but which were now there, before me, without metaphors, without layers, without masks. It was in this process of solitary, secret, silent reading that I realized it wasn't just the text being revealed. It was my own soul being decoded. From that moment I knew what began as intellectual curiosity was becoming an internal calling, and to ignore that would be lying to myself once again. From the moment I began reading the Quran seriously, something inside me no longer left me in peace. During the day, I continued as always, seeing patients, reviewing exams, smiling with colleagues at the hospital. At night, however, I became another man. My hands still held the Vedic texts, but my eyes sought another light. My nightly ritual became a silent battle. I placed the books side by side. On one side, the Upanishads, on the other, the Quran. On one side, commentaries by Hindu sages. On the other, the words of Prophet Muhammad. I wasn't trying to prove which was better. That would be superficial. I wanted to understand what was truth, which revelation really pointed to the Creator, without shadows, without mythology, without contradictions. Questions began to accumulate. Why did so many gods overlap in Hinduism, when even the texts themselves said the Absolute was unique and invisible? Why did so many rituals depend on physical objects, material offerings, when the heart itself, sometimes dry, seemed more important than all that? In Islam, for the first time, I found a concept of God that didn't need an image. A God without form, without limits, without invented name, but completely present. And this kept me awake. I spent weeks waking up in the middle of the night with a tight heart, not from fear, but from urgency, as if something inside me said, "You already know. Now stop running away." But how could I simply turn my back on an entire tradition? How could I abandon an identity that shaped my childhood, my studies, my career, my place in society? It was as if I were between two mirrors. One reflected what I had been, the other showed what I could be, and in the middle of this I felt suspended. But there was a stark difference between the two. The mirror of the past demanded that I pretend. The one of the present demanded only that I be honest. It was on one of those nights that I realized it was no longer a comparison between religions. It was a confrontation between appearance and truth. And in that dark room with books open on the floor and tears in my eyes, I understood. The answer wouldn't come from outside. It was already screaming inside me. No spiritual transformation happens without conflict. And my greatest battlefield wasn't the temple, nor logic, nor books. It was inside my home. My family had always been traditional. Priests, teachers, merchants, all connected in some way to the roots of Hinduism. My father, already deceased, was a devout man who said, "To honor our faith is to honor those who came before us." I grew up hearing this, and for a long time, I believed that changing paths would mean betraying my lineage. How would I explain to my wife that the chants we had sung together for more than 3 decades no longer touched my spirit? How could I look at my mother and say that the formless God she silently reveres has a name and clear revelation in Islam? How could I face the disappointment of my brothers, all still priests, upon learning that I was questioning the foundation of everything we had learned together? These questions crushed me. It wasn't fear of rejection. It was the pain of imagining that those I loved most would see me as someone who had abandoned his heritage. Hindu culture doesn't separate religion from identity. Leaving rituals is often seen as a type of social death, and I knew this. But at the same time, how could I continue living a faith that no longer reached me? How could I recite mantras with my mouth if my heart was beating with other names? I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I also couldn't continue lying to myself every day just to maintain appearances. It was in this dilemma that I discovered something no scripture had taught me. Truth hurts, but liberates. Lies comfort, but make one sick. My eldest daughter, who had converted to Islam after marriage, was the first to notice my restlessness. One day, in silence, she simply told me, "Father, there is no shame in seeking what is true. There is only dignity in it." That phrase echoed in my mind for days. It was then that I understood the greatest honor I can offer my family is to be sincere with my soul, even if it costs traditions, titles, or the approval of others. I didn't choose Islam on impulse. I chose it because, faced with all voices, it was the only one that spoke directly to my heart and answered me. Curiously, it wasn't a debate, a lecture, or a book that moved me most. It was my daughter and her husband. 2 discreet, humble young people, convinced Muslims but without ostentation. They never tried to convince me of anything. They never pointed out flaws in my faith, but the way they lived spoke too loudly to be ignored. I remember the first time I visited their home after the wedding. I expected to find a cold, rigid environment, perhaps even disconnected from the culture we knew, but I saw exactly the opposite. There was serenity, there was order, there was reverence, not to objects, but to coexistence. And above all, there was something rare nowadays: peace. I observed how they treated each other. There was respect in their gestures, modesty in their words, cooperation in their tasks. Neither of them needed to exalt themselves to be heard, and when prayer time came, everything stopped. In silence, naturally, they turned to Allah like someone drinking water, without fanfare, without haste, without distraction. And then I watched their children, my grandchildren, being raised with a gentle firmness. They learned to say Bismillah before eating. They learned to ask for forgiveness, to give thanks. And they did this not out of fear of divine punishment, but because they understood it was part of life. That home that confronted me. It was simple, without idols, without golden symbols, but it was profoundly spiritually alive. And all of this happened without them needing to say a single word to me. One night after dinner, I offered to help collect the dishes. My daughter just smiled and said, "Father, you know, what guides us is not what we see, but what is above, and everything we do here is for Him." It was there that I understood. She hadn't abandoned faith. She had found real faith, and I was still trapped in the shell of religiosity, while she had already plunged into the content. It was in this context, without pressure or speeches, that my heart truly began to open. The greatest sermon I received didn't come from a pulpit. It came from the way my daughter cared for her home, from the way my son-in-law treated his wife, and from the spiritual lightness that hovered over that house. They didn't preach, they lived. And that was more than enough to make me listen with my heart to the call that Allah was already making. The first time I stood up to pray as a Muslim, it wasn't beautiful. There were no tears, no immediate spiritual ecstasy. There was strangeness, physical discomfort, insecurity in movements, and above all, a silent fear of doing everything wrong. I was alone in the room, doors closed. I had watched videos, read instructions, memorized basic words. And even so, when I raised my hands and said, Allahu Akbar, I felt a weight on my chest that almost made me retreat. It wasn't fear of God. It was fear of myself, fear of crossing a line from which there would be no return. I bowed my body, prostrated my forehead on the ground. That position, so vulnerable, deconstructed me. Never in all my years of Hindu rituals had I placed myself physically so low. The idea of bowing completely before a single God, invisible, without form, without image, broke me inside, but at the same time, rebuilt me. It was strange. My body, accustomed to ceremonial temple positions, protested against that new posture. My knees hurt, my forehead sweated, my hands trembled, but my heart, for the first time in many years, was quiet. In that first prayer, I didn't feel immediate illumination, but I felt something even rarer, truth. Each movement had purpose. Each phrase had clarity. Nothing was too symbolic or hidden or embellished. It was simple, it was direct, and for that very reason, it was profound. When I finished, I sat on the floor, in silence, with my eyes still closed, and I realized that, for the first time, I had spoken with God, without needing to go through myths, intermediaries, or complex rituals. Just me and Him. I didn't understand all the meanings yet, but I understood the most important thing, that there in that ordinary room, without incense, without statues, without elaborate chants, God was listening to me. It was at that moment that something was reborn in me, and it wasn't emotion, it was consciousness, the certainty that regardless of what the world around me thought, I had found a path that finally made sense, inside and out. That was the day my body bowed, but my soul rose, and it never went back to sleep. There was no public announcement, no speech, no dramatic farewell, only silence, and a decision I knew would change everything. After weeks of reflection and nights in prayer, I understood that I could no longer continue wearing the skin of something that no longer represented me. I entered the temple on an ordinary day, the same flowers, the same voices, the same steps echoing on the stone floor, but that day the place seemed emptier than ever, not on the outside, but inside. My heart no longer responded to the sounds, my soul no longer moved with the gestures. I finished the ceremony as usual. I recited the mantras, I distributed blessings, I smiled. But at the end, I went to the priest's room, carefully folded my white robe, the one I had worn for more than 30 years, and left it on the chair. I left in silence. No one understood immediately, but inside me, everything was clear. Many thought I was tired. Others thought it was a personal crisis. Only a few knew and didn't understand. I was called a traitor, ungrateful, someone who had lost his roots. I heard that I was rejecting the gods, dishonoring the lineage of my ancestors. But that wasn't it. I wasn't rejecting my origins. I was simply refusing to live a faith that no longer dwelt in me. Saying goodbye to the role of priest wasn't a denial of my history. It was an affirmation of my conscience. I didn't feel smaller. I didn't feel ashamed. For the first time, I felt whole. Some people looked at me with pity, others with contempt, but the one who surprised me most was my wife. She said nothing on the first day. She just looked into my eyes and asked, "Do you have peace with this choice?" And when I answered yes, she took my hand in silence. Her pain was visible, but there was also respect, and that gave me strength to continue. I removed the robe, yes, but I didn't lose my dignity. On the contrary, I recovered what for years I'd been trying to find through clothes, gestures, and words, a real connection with God. The renunciation was silent, but inside me, it was like thunder, and when it passed, everything became clearer and lighter. My routine continues in many ways the same. I wake up early, I go to the hospital, I see my patients, I read exams, I make decisions that can save or change lives. But there is something in me that has completely changed, And this silent change has transformed everything around me. Today, before entering any surgery, I pray, not as a mechanical act, not as an urgent request, but as a surrender. I perform my ablutions discreetly, find a quiet corner, sometimes inside the office itself, and place my forehead on the ground. And there, in that simple gesture, I remind myself, I am not the one who heals. It is Allah who permits it. Prayer, which I once saw as a strange custom of others, is now my axis. 5 pauses in the day that don't take time from me. They give me perspective back. Between one appointment and another, even if the world is in disorder, those minutes before Allah reorganize my interior. Some colleagues have noticed that something has changed in me. They say I'm calmer, more steady, more serene. They ask what happened, and sometimes I just smile. Other times I share parts of my story, not with the intention to convince, but with the sincere desire to show that faith didn't limit me. It freed me. My relationship with patients has also changed. Before, I saw bodies. Today, I see souls inside the bodies, and this changes everything. I pray for them in silence. And when I perceive that someone is in existential suffering, not just physical, I say, with all delicacy, we are not alone. We never are. My children respect my path. My granddaughters ask to pray with me. And my wife gradually began to accompany me in silent prayers at dawn. I don't know how far she will go, but I know that Allah guides hearts at the right time. And that's enough. Today, I am still a doctor. I still have my reputation. I am still called doctor by patients and grandpa by children. But inside I am just a servant, a man who finally understood that true healing begins in the heart. Islam didn't distance me from my vocation. It gave purpose to what my hands had been doing for decades. And now every life I touch, every word I say, every step I take, is guided by something greater. I spent most of my life studying sacred books, medical sciences, Eastern philosophies. I went through temples, conferences, debate forums. I was respected as a priest, admired as a doctor, but none of these titles filled the space that existed within me. It was only when I stopped seeking answers to win arguments and began searching for the truth that transforms the heart, that the light began to turn on. And that light led me to Islam. What conquered me wasn't miracles, nor momentary emotions. It was logic, clarity, depth, the coherence between what one believes and what one lives. In Islam, I found the God I had always sensed, invisible, incomparable, absolute, but who at the same time is closer to us than the air we breathe. If you have made it this far, listening to every part of my testimony, I thank you. I don't know what you believe. I don't know what your path is, but I know something. If this story touched you in some way, perhaps it's because your soul is also searching for something true. If that's the case, don't ignore this calling. Question, read, observe, pray, even if you don't yet know how, because God hears even before language. And if you know someone who, like me, is silently searching for meaning, share this testimony. Perhaps what transformed my life can ignite something in another person's heart as well. Send it to your groups, social networks, to that friend who always asks deep questions and who perhaps just needs to hear that they are not alone. Today, my journey doesn't end. Every day I still learn. I still make mistakes. I still cry out. But now I know to whom I am crying out. And if you want to continue hearing stories like this of real people, of transformed lives, of silent encounters with truth, don't miss watching the next testimony. Every soul has a path. Every story has a turning point. And sometimes all we need is to hear one that reminds us there is still time to begin again. Because when truth enters, the heart responds. And it's never possible to live the same way again.